But to everyone who's joining in with us this evening, it's really so lovely to have you all here. So thank you so much. I know I speak on behalf of myself and Trevor when I say that we really are thrilled to have Gabriel with us this evening. Gabriel is obviously joining us from New York this evening to speak about the new book that he's just recently published, Walking with Ghosts, which you can see I have many a note scribbled in beside me here. And as people will be familiar, Gabriel was born in Dublin and in addition to starring in over 80 films, has won a Golden Globe, has won multiple Tony nominations. And as we discovered while reading this book, a lot of his formative memories happened during his time here in Dublin. So Gabriel, we're going to really look forward to talking about the book with you this evening. But I guess just to start off and say, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time. And you know, with this particularly bizarre moment we're living through at the moment, how is life in New York?
I'm not actually in New York, Sarah. I'm in Maine, which is where I mostly live. I haven't been to New York for quite a while. We're reasonably isolated down here, and Maine was one of the least affected places with COVID. Yeah, I have to go up to New York in 2 weeks' time, and friends of mine have told me that it's just not pleasant there at all.
Okay.
Gabriel, the book is a fantastic work of art, and I congratulate you. It's really powerful. I read it in 2 sittings. I laughed a lot, but I have to admit it also brought me to tears on occasion. It reminded me of, I kind of see it in the tradition of the great Dublin memoir. It reminded me a little bit of the Mannix Flynn, the Nothing to Say in parts. Reminded me a little bit of the Tony Cronin, the Dead as Doornails book in other parts. And I congratulate you. It's as I say, it's a super piece of work. It's you're strikingly ambivalent about fame and celebrity in it, and it seems to me that it's really a much more personal work. It's about faith and about the loss of faith, I think, about fame and about the price of fame, about alcohol as well, about what it's like to be an introvert, but also a public figure. But ultimately, I think it's a kind of it's a tribute to 2 remarkable people. And I mean your parents, Eileen and Dan. And I wonder if you'd start just telling us maybe the story of how they met.
Do you want me to read a little bit about that from the book?
As you wish, or to talk about it as you wish.
Well, I'll read just a little. I don't want to read too much from the book, but maybe just a little bit. When I talked to my father separately to my mother about how they met, it was very revealing to me, because in relating to me their story, they were also relating something much more universal, which is how people meet, how they come together, and the absolute accident of that. Sometimes the accident of how we're all brought together. And as I said, separately, I asked them how they met. And I'll just read what my father said. He was from Kildare, from what was, I suppose, still is called the country. So he said, I ran away from home to the city as quick as ever I could. I wanted more than just labouring for the big farmers, snagging turnips out in all weather. So I joined the army to see the world. Never got beyond Dublin. That's as far as I got. Till that night, I took shelter in the doorway, and your mother was standing beside me, and I wanted to talk to her. But I was a bit timid and didn't want to be too forward, and I couldn't think of anything to say. Then I saw her with no matches for her cigarette, and that was my way in. I knew she was for me. We got married in Westland Road Church shortly after, and in less than a year into the world, we brought you. My mother told me. Oh, we used to play tennis and go to dances on our nights off at the Metropole mostly. All the nurses did. It had a grand ballroom and a good orchestra, and it was always stuffed to the gills. One night I was coming in on the bus to meet a few of the girls for something to eat in Wynn's Hotel before the dance. It wasn't done for women to be seen smoking on the bus at that time, so I hopped off at a stop before the bridge. It started to rain, and the next thing I was in the doorway of a shop and rooting in my handbag for matches. And this fellow in an army uniform leaned over with a match and his hand over the flame. We got talking, and it turned out that he was off to the Metropole as well. Well, we danced that night and we met the next week, and that was it for good and all. It was our fate to meet like that because of the rain and the matches and the Metropole and the doorway. And if it hadn't happened like that, you mightn't be here now. Isn't that a strange thing to think, the way we all come into the world?
It's gorgeous.
And I think that everybody has in their own story with their parents. It's an interesting thing to ask your parents, how did you meet? But to examine the minute accidental circumstances around that, if you hadn't opened that door that day, if you hadn't sat in the cafe that day, if you didn't know that guy who knew that other guy's sister, would you be here? So that's what they were really telling me, was that although it was fate, it was also a complete accident. And so, yeah, so it was a meaningful and revealing story for me, because you can trace everybody's presence in the world through a series of accidents.
That's incredibly beautiful. I think it's as someone who, I guess, whose own personal story started with her father failing university the first time around and doing better the second year. It's lovely to talk about this idea of chance and the impact that the people that you meet have on your own life and generations that follow that. And it's particularly special to hear it from both your mum and your dad's perspective. And one thing that myself and Trevor were only speaking about earlier on today when we were talking about this evening was how it was such a privilege in reading the book to see how you've, I guess, traced the key events throughout the course of your own life and your career. You've talked about your childhood growing up in Dublin. You've talked about your life as an actor in, I guess, the more recent times. And one sentence that we had an interesting chat earlier about was when Richard Burton turned around to you and said, fame doesn't necessarily change you, but it changes everyone around you. And I guess I wonder if you could talk to us, either read or tell us as you prefer, about the passage where you spoke about Paganini, the plumber, and the different ways that he came into your life as a child, but then also in the south of France years later.
Yeah, I really, yes, it is my personal story, but I did also want to reveal a bigger picture behind I wanted to place myself in a context. And I am the result of the culture of the country, the town I was brought up in. I'm also the product of the education I received there and the religion that was part and parcel of my growing up there, because the culture was very much about how Catholicism was linked into every day. Hard to believe that now, but it was then. My father used to refer to the streets around where we lived and the town of Dublin generally as being a theatre. And when I think about Dublin at that time, I think of it sometimes as like this set, and all these characters going in and out of it. Of course, we didn't know they were characters at the time. And the great thing about characters is that they don't know they're characters. So you're allowed to look on them and experience them without any kind of judgment on their part. It was only later when I went to look back and see how all these influences had formed me that I realized also that the individuals, the actors, if you like, who lived on those streets also formed who I was and formed my relationship to the world. And Paganini was a plumber who lived quite near us, and he was a man who worked 5.5 days a week, 14 hours, whatever it was. And he would come down the street in these overalls covered in oil, and his wife would meet him at the door, and she'd immediately douse him with holy water and look around the street to see was there anybody looking in, to see what they could see in the hallway. And she'd close the door and he'd go in. Well, we'd be playing football on the street, and you would hear the music. The window would be open and you'd hear his violin music playing. And he had everything from, Mahler to Irish jigs. And sometimes you could tell his mood from the kind of music that came out through the window. And then just as suddenly, the music would stop and it would go silent. And everybody would know that Paganini was gone to this other place where he wasn't available anymore. Looking back on that, what it was now was his deep depression, which kept him a prisoner, really. I was friends with their son, and I used to see that little world that was in there. She would make the dinner for him. She'd cut up his meat for him. She'd have a pint of water, a pint of milk beside him, and he'd eat it. And then he'd go into the living room, and he would take out this violin. And as I said in the book, like a baby, he would take it out, and he would handle it as gently as a baby, and then he'd put it under his chin, and he would play. Well, I never knew what those silences really meant until I was much older. And I never knew what it was that Paganini suffered from. And people didn't talk about things like that. There wasn't even a name for it. There was no emotional language to describe your inner feelings at that time. Now we've all been oprified and we're all hugging and there's orchestras playing and we're resolving things and finding closure and all these things. That language didn't exist. So nobody spoke about his silence. But out of nowhere, the window would open again and the music would play. And I realized that in my own life later on, I experienced that silence that Paganini went through, because I suffered myself from depression, which I can only describe as a negative thought that gets connected to another negative thought that becomes a chain of negative thinking. And before you know what's going on, it's reality. And you can't kind of break it out from it. But of course, nobody understood that at the time. Or at least they understood it. It was never spoken about. And so I realized I had far more in common with people like Paganini, who just seemed to be random people that lived. I realized that my future self was already being formed by those streets in that city. And I always think we are what we were. We think we're this incredibly sophisticated, multiracial society where everything has been resolved. Well, of course, we didn't get here overnight. It took a lot of breaking down of barriers and people lifting up rocks and maggots coming out for us to see who we essentially are. And it's not that we've gotten rid of all those things, we haven't. But I realized I owed very much more to Dublin than I thought I had, because I thought once I left, I said, that's Dublin, Ireland done. Now it's time for me to, but of course, you are, wherever you go, there you are. You bring these things with you. And in relation to the fame thing, what Burton was actually saying was that you don't change. How can you change? You can't become something else. What happens is that your identity is challenged in a way that can be very disconcerting, because we build up our identities slowly and through great pain and sometimes suffering and joy and exposure and all this. And you think, this is who I am. And then suddenly this event happens and everybody is telling you in one way or another, that's not who you are. This is who you are now. So there's a paradox there, a real conflict between trying to hold on to who you are essentially inside and being asked to be this other person that you have no idea how to kind of act in those situations. And I think that happens to a great extent also when people leave their native city or their native town or so forth. You really have to examine your identity, because people in Ireland don't go around saying, oh, you're Irish. I didn't know you were Irish. Where are you from? Donegal. I'm from Kildare. When you leave Ireland, you have to, the first thing you have to do is identify yourself as Irish, because that's what people do to you. They say, oh, you're Irish. And then you meet people who are Irish and you say, oh, what part of Ireland are you from? You've never had to identify yourself as that until you leave. So the question of identity is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Who are you? Who are you at this moment? Who have you been? And who are you going to be? They're all connected, because the whole purpose of life, as I think it was Plato or Socrates, I can't remember, said the journey to find out who you are is the journey of life. That's what it's about, and that entails identity and experience and all those things that we talked about.
That's beautifully put. Gabriel, that portrait that you've just given us of Paganini, with the silences that are so resonant, I wonder if you met somebody who hadn't been to Ireland, hadn't been around at that time, and you're trying to describe the wider culture, the society that you're growing up in the 50s and 60s. How would you describe it in quite formal terms? You know, how would you describe it to an outsider?
Well, I think to a great extent we're not aware of the actual time. To a great extent of when we live, we're not constantly saying, well, isn't this an amazing day that we're having here in Dublin in the year? Time is a very, and I talk in the book about what time is. Time is an absolute, it's impossible to define time, because even having made that sentence, it's already in the past. So the 60s, you know, if you're in London and somebody says to you, oh, the 60s, the swinging 60s, now you may have experienced that or you may not have experienced that. But I tend to think of the older generation that were alive in the 60s. These are people who are parents who had come through the Second World War and the Depression. And some of them haven't come through the First World War. So you had 2 wars and a depression. And there you were in London being bombed, 7 nights a week, wondering would you see the next day. What did those people feel about the swinging 60s there? Because you had parents trying to deal with boys having long hair. Even that alone in itself, that was something that really threatened that society, because it was like, we don't care who you are anymore. The line between what we think of male and female is gone. We're growing our hair long. It's a sign of protest. They had to deal with the pill. That means that their daughters had access to sexual experience whenever they wanted. Now, it meant that women had control over their sex life, and it actually meant, God forbid, that women could enjoy sex. You also had Vietnam. You had a time of incredible turbulence. In 1945, I'm talking about England now, but everything that happened in England, it's like sleeping beside the elephant. If the elephant twitches, the elephant could fall over on top of you. So England was our elephant, and we slept beside that elephant. And things were beginning to leak in through snow-covered screens where people were adjusting aerials on the roof to get BBC and ITV and Radio Luxembourg. Those influences were beginning to come in and clash with the deeply rooted influences in Ireland in the 60s. The church, the state, immigration, all those things that formed what it was like to be there. The permissive society didn't quite get into Ireland, but I do remember girls walking around in short skirts, what were then seen as short skirts, and people saying things like, well, that skirt is only 3 inches below sea level, that one has on her, you know. And there was this idea that sexual freedom, the ability to protest, the ability to question, they're doing it over there. That was beginning to creep in. And it was even then, even though the church was still all powerful and it was in direct, like they acted with the state in so many areas, it was beginning to leak in. And I don't think we had the same experience as, say, people in London or other places had, but parents were beginning to think about how the world was changing. Nuclear power, Vietnam, student protests, the pill, free education, all those things were beginning to happen. And they changed Ireland in the 60s, leading into the 70s. And it took that length of time for it to change. Remember, you know, this is a hard thing for some people who weren't around at that time to contemplate, that in the 60s, the books of Edna O'Brien were burned publicly. Now that's not that long ago, that a parish priest or a bishop decided that those books needed to be burned because they were about a woman's sexual desires, yearnings, fantasies, or even experience. Is very mild when we look at the country girls now, but somebody was so threatened by that they burned it. At the same time, in London in 1966, Mick Jagger was in a pair of bell-bottoms, you know, showing his midriff. Now, it wasn't just that they banned Edna O'Brien for mildly sexual kind of references. Ideas were banned. Sartre, Camus, you know, George Orwell. These were ideas that were kept out because if you have a thinking society, you have a dangerous society. So despite all that censorship, and it was censorship of sexuality, of political ideas, of ideas, social ideas, the result was that Ireland at that time was kind of like a prison, and you broke out of it at your, you know, if you decided to break out of it, it wasn't going to go well for you. John McGahern, who wrote a book called The Dark, which was a transformative book in Irish literature. It changed Irish society. He was thrown out of his job as a school teacher, and he married a girl from Finland. And he recounted that incident where he met a government minister who said to him, well, we could have got by okay with the book. We could have like buried that somewhere, he said. But why did you have to go and marry a foreigner? He said, isn't there thousands of Irish girls with their tongues hanging out looking for a man? That's almost a direct quote. So you can see how insular and parochial, and that if a parish priest stood on a pulpit and denounced you from the pulpit for any reason, that was a major thing. They also read out every Sunday how much you had given to the church. So if you were the local butcher and you could afford a couple of quid more, you were read out as having given £10. If you were the woman with 6 kids and a husband who was, you know, working in the dairy to try and keep things going together, you were read out as having given £2 or £1 or 10 shillings or whatever. So the priest and the state had absolute control. And the revolution that's happened in Ireland, it's hard to kind of comprehend if you're 20 or 21 years of age, but revolutions don't happen overnight, as I said, and artists and thinkers and intellectuals and rebels and people who go against the grain, they're the dogs that bark before the earthquake. And they're the ones that we have to listen to.
I think they're the ones that someone like myself, say in my 30s, would have an awful lot to be thankful for. And I think that is, you know, there's that you stand on the shoulders of giants, isn't that the quote? But
yes,
you kind of, that was a kind of a beautiful summary and kind of a bit of a snapshot of what a particular moment was like. And I know within the book, when you're talking about your own personal experiences of growing up, you grew up in Walkinstown, and you spoke about, you know, sharing a bed with your younger brothers, the sisters in the hallway just across the room, and you were talking about one of the really key elements that was quite informative and quite impactful on your life in your early childhood in 1961, when a priest comes into your school and pitches the idea of the priesthood by saying, to have been chosen is the greatest gift that any family could have. And I kind of, because you have mentioned the role of the church, I wonder if you might take us back to when you were 11 years old and tell us a little bit about your own personal journey.
I like to quote George Bernard Shaw, who is also from Dublin, who said, on some interview that he gave, he said, "My education did not begin until I left school." And I agree with that. Nobody.
Great impersonation of George Bernard Shaw there. Fair play.
I wasn't doing that to show off. I just, like, when I think of him, I always think of that. You know, his he did one of the very first interviews on television in 1936 in his garden at Ayotte St. Lawrence in Buckinghamshire. And he managed in a sentence to sum up what television is really about. And he said, well, here, it's television. You can see me, but I cannot see you. Now, that's what television is. We're looking at the TV and we see them, but they can't see. Anyway, so to go back to the question, yeah, education, not to be pedantic about it, but I do believe that education is about the encouragement of curiosity in the child. It's about saying to a child, ask as many questions as you want. I'm here to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll look it up. I'm not going to bullshit you and pretend I know the answer. A child's mind is like a garden. You grow flowers in it, or you let it go to weed, or you know. So, and I think that's true of being an adult as well, by the way. You talk to the child. You say, how are you? How's it going? What are you interested in? What do you like? What do you not like? Et cetera. What would you like to, like, one of the ways that uncomfortable adults had of dealing with children would be, like, they'd say to you, "Oh, what are you going to be when you grow up?" As if you knew. You hadn't, like, that's why kids end up saying things like, "I want to be a fireman" or something, because nobody ever really truly hones in on the kid as an individual and takes the business of developing their minds in a serious way. Education was a one fits, you know, it's like one system suits all. If you're not good at maths, you get whacked. If you're good at languages, that's great, but you're not good at this. So there were kids who were great at mathematics who weren't good at English. There were kids who were fabulous at English who didn't know and didn't care about if it takes 3 men to dig a hole, how many days does it take, et cetera, et cetera. Those kind of idiotic things that I never understood. My education at that time, and I'm only talking from my point of view because I know other people didn't have that experience, was based on fear. I spent my time at the back trying to stay out of out of sight. So your refuge in those situations was imagination. And I used to look out the window of the school. And for a second, I'll do a little. I feel like a foreign correspondent here. Yes, it's quite, yeah. I used to look out the window and imagine the mountain beyond. I could see Oisin on the white horse coming down. My imagination helped me to escape from that room. And one day, I loved the stories that the brothers or the teachers would tell, because I could really get into the stories of Patrick Sarsfield or Brian Baru or whoever it was. One day, this priest showed up. He walked into the room and he had a slide projector, and he showed all these things on the wall of these men in straw hats on horses crossing rivers and, looking up at things and pointing. And I thought, wow, that looks like an amazing place, because it wasn't Dublin. It wasn't now. It wasn't fear. It was out there in the sunshine, far away. So it clicked into my head. My imagination latched onto it, and it took me away. And I thought, if I could go there, but of course I wasn't going there. I was going to a seminary in England at 11 years of age on the boat to do 5 years to become a priest. What I look back on now is my innocence, the innocence of my family, my mother, my father, the families around who thought there was nothing wrong with putting an 11-year-old child on a boat and a train and sending them to a different country. And also the cynicism of the Catholic priesthood targeting young, innocent minds and saying, would you like to do this? Well, of course you'd like to do it, because the whole culture weighed in behind you and said, this is the most wonderful thing. And they used to say, well, if God is calling you, you'll hear it. Now, when you're 11 years of age and you go quiet and you say, do I have a vocation? And there's something inside you that says, yes, you have. Well, they say that's the voice of God. It's actually only yourself answering yourself. But I was convinced that I had a vocation. I was called. And so therefore I was special. And my family was special and so forth. And the idea of it being done now is like almost impossible. The parents would let their children go away to do that at such a tender and vulnerable age.
Yeah, it's brilliantly documented in the book, Gabriel. That and it's extremely moving, that account of being in the seminary. There's also great lightness in the book, though, as well. There's a lot of self-deprecation, and when you're eventually kicked out of the seminary, which is probably just as well, frankly, you come back to Dublin, and then you kind of embark on this journey, and eventually you make it, to this decision that you're going to become an actor. But before that, you try lots of different things, and you become what you call a dreadful plumber. And then you say at one point you're working as a toilet attendant at a major Dublin hotel. But it's this account of working as a door-to-door salesman, and then got on to UCD, that I, if you're happy to, I'd love you to read next, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Well, it's probably a bit long, so I'll just briefly recount it. When I came back from England, I felt like I was a complete failure, that I'd been thrown out of, the priesthood. So I thought of myself as a kind of a failed priest. And my father used to say, the only thing that will stand to you is a trade. You have to get a trade. But I was ill-suited for a trade. He because he worked in Guinness's at the time, knew this man, and I found myself in a boiler suit in the engine room of a church, putting in heating. And I was so bad that they used to say to me, go back to the shop and get a wrench, and don't get the bus, because then I'd be gone for most of the day. One guy said to me, you are the worst apprentice I have ever come across in 40 years in the plumbing game. You're absolutely useless. And I still see all those buildings around Dublin that I was involved in, and I think, oh geez, those poor people don't know. I hope they sorted out the damage that I did there. But I know all those places. Then I worked later on in a factory. I went back to London in a teddy bear factory, which was the work was so mindless. My job was to put eyes in the heads of teddy bears and do this while we were listening to, the radio. And eventually one day the gaffer in a long brown coat, a man who had won the pools, by the way, he had won the pools and refused to give up his job in the toy factory. We used to call him Mini Hitler. He had a little mustache on him. And he used to come in and he'd say, Gabriel, can I ask you something? I say, yeah, sure, Albert. What is it? He said, have you ever seen teddy bears with eyes in the backs of their heads? And then I went into I became an apprentice chef with my brother, who was a chef in Dublin. And he told me to wash everything that came over, because I was washing up. And he said, whatever comes over here, wash it. That's all you have to do. And stay in here. Don't come out into the kitchen. Stay in there, wash what comes in. It's a simple. I said, okay. So I washed away quite happily, whistling, until one day my brother comes over in his sweat with his towel around his, checked apron. He says, where's the cauliflower? I said, what cauliflower? He said, the cauliflower that we left outside there. I said, the thing in the big pot. He said, yeah, the cauliflower. I said, you told me to wash not the fucking cauliflower. Did you throw out the cauliflower? And the next thing, the chef comes out. There's a big German guy. He comes out and says, where's the cauliflower? I said, that chef has got. He threw it out by accident, chef. There's 150 people waiting for the cauliflower. So I got demoted and I ended up as a toilet cleaner. So eventually I became a door-to-door salesman with this incredibly handsome guy from Belfast. And we used to go around, and I remember this, we used to sit on these floral sofas with these women in Stillorgan and Dalkey and places. And we had this spiel learned off, where we would say to them, and Mrs. Gilhooly, if you buy a set of Encyclopedia Britannica over a period of 3 years on the hire purchase, you will also be the recipient of a 2-year free subscription to Field and Stream. To which a woman said to me, why would I want 2 years of Field and Stream? It's a fishing thing to get you to. And I remember he was so incredibly handsome. A woman said to him once, she said, you look like the Sundance Kid, like your man Robert Redford. And I was kind of edging over and hoping she might say, and you look like Butcher. She didn't say that. Anyway, what he would do is he'd say to me, if I gave you the nod, get out. So I remember there was this woman, I'm telling you much more than I should, but this happened. There was a woman, and I remember the number of the door and I remember the street, and I wonder if she's still going, but she was there and she'd had a couple of early morning sherries, it seemed. And we were sitting there talking, and eventually we gave up all pretense of selling encyclopedias, and we were just talking. And he turns to me and he says, I think you should go check, see what's going on down the road there. And I say, yeah, okay. No, now it needs to be checked now so that we can. I got the hint and I went out, and he came out. I remember standing outside the house and watching the little Venetian blinds just clicking shut. And then half an hour later, he came out straight in his tie. And he said, you know what I love about this game? He said, okay, he said, 8 women will say no to buying encyclopedias. He said, the 9th will say, I have to ask my husband when he comes home. You're never going to get her. He said, but the 10th one, he said, we'll buy. And he said, that was a double score in there. She's buying. And she bought, you know. So that's what we lived in, this sexual world of infinite possibility, dragging our encyclopedias around. And then I one day I just woke up and I said, I have to go back to school. I can't go on being like, you know, an idiot going around Dublin trying to be good at all these jobs. So I went back to school and a night school in Emmett Road in Inchicore, and then I went back to full-time school and then to university.
And as someone who kind of has worked in sales jobs in the past, I find it really fascinating listening to you talking about the kind of the sales element of that role and the kind of the insights that you could get into acting from those sorts of conversations. And I'd love if you'd just take us back to the kind of beginning of your acting career. And you know, one of your first key moments here in Ireland was being on the O'Riordans, and the story about that journey that you took to an Irish local village on a particularly wet day in the 1970s, I found particularly charming. If you might share that with us.
Well, that was a time when there wasn't 500 channels to choose from. There were, at that time, there was one channel, and this particular soap opera was a rural soap opera, for those people who don't remember it. And it went out every Sunday night. The two things that you watched over the weekend were the Late Late Show. This was before Ryan Tubridy was born, and the Riordans. And everybody talked about those programs during the week. So I had become an actor because I joined an amateur drama group for something to do at nighttime. I didn't set out to be anything more than just have a bit of a laugh at nighttime. But anyway, I ended up on that particular show, and it was astonishing to me how those people were lionized and revered. They were more real than real, if you know what I mean. And one of the perks of being on that show was that you were asked by various people down the country to go and open things like fetes or carnivals or whatever. And one of the actors in the thing said to me, if you get offered one of these gigs, he says, you'll get a good few quid into your hand. But he says, you have to go down there and you have to like give it a bit of glam. So I said, what do you mean? He says, you have to wear like something white suit, like you're coming from. So he said, you can borrow my suit. And I borrowed his suit, which was white bell bottoms at the time, big wide lapels. And I went down there and I arrived in the town and there wasn't a soul in the town. And I was standing there in my white suit and I thought, Jesus Christ, what? And this guy came up to me and he said, oh, no, they're all waiting for you in the sports field. So I went out to the sports field and there was a guy, I kid you not, dressed in a green outfit as a kind of a leprechaun type figure. And he put me into this pony and trap. And he brought me in the pony and trap through these people, shouting my character's name at me. And one of the storylines was that I was having an affair with the wife of one of the main characters. And there was people shouting, oh, Jesus, yeah, boy, yeah. You know, those kind of things. And I arrived at this place and the entire village was there. And there was a priest with a glass eye sitting on this podium, a local Fianna Fáil councillor, and a girl who had won Miss Tractor of the year or something, agriculture like that. And I had to put the thing over her. And then I had to lead the walk. And the microphone kept going in and out, all that kind of stuff, and feedback and everything else. And finally, I went out onto the road, followed by the entire town, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. And halfway through, it started to rain, and then it started to really bucket down. And I sheltered under a tree with these people who started, because we were trapped under a tree in the rain. So formality was kind of abandoned. And one of them said to me, "Geez, you're much different now than you are on the television." I'd say, yeah, that's what he said. And he said, does that be real drink now? You used to be drinking there, and no, that's just tea. Jesus, tea, cold tea. Imagine that now. And then somebody else said, "Well, you know what? You're not the first film star." I wasn't a film star. You're not the first film star that came through here, you know. Jane Mansfield on her way to Tralee. Somebody else said that she was just going to the toilet over in Kelly's. She wasn't here. And so all that stuff was going on, and I came out from under the tree. It started again, and by the time we got another 200 yards, I was soaked. So I said, "Let's go into the pub," and we all went into the pub, and we sat there, and there was a big sing-song, and I got completely drunk, and the guy who had brought me down from Dublin was paralytic, was lying up against the wall, and could not be, roused to bring me back to Dublin. It was at a time when people would drive like that, horrendous to believe, but people would drive like the no seat belts, smoke, and driving with one eye. And finally I said, "Look, okay, I'll do myself." And I went up to the top of the road, and I thumbed back in a white suit, soaked to the skin, with my thumb out, and the van stopped with all these children in it, and this man and the wife, and they pulled down the window, and the man says, "Jesus, is it yourself? Oh, come on. You're joking me. What are you doing out here at this hour of the night in a white suit? Do you know who this is, kids?" And they all looked out at me like they hadn't a clue. "Where are you going?" I'm trying to get back to Dublin. "Jeez, get in the back there. Make a bit of room for the man there." And that's how I got back to Dublin. That was early fame for me. Somebody said to me, "What was it like to deal with Hollywood?" I had my preparation done long before I ever went to Hollywood.
The book is full of just brilliant stories like that, Gabriel. And you spare no one, but particularly yourself. The one that really made me laugh out loud was the Galway, the Q&A at the Galway Film Festival, when your mother decided to get involved. You might share that with our viewers, please.
Well, very, very briefly, I'll describe that. I had come back to Ireland after my first film had just been released in England, and it was a big critical success. It was called Defense of the Realm. So I was coming back to talk about it, and I was interviewed on the stage in Dublin, in Galway, and there was quite a few people there, and the interviewer did it, and now we'll open it out to the public. My mother, like a lot of Irish mothers, I suppose, she'd never compliment you directly, but she'd tell the neighbours, and she'd be proud of you and keep cuttings and things like that, but never say anything complimentary. And so I put it on a par with this. This is a story that maybe some people know, but I've never told it before. There was an Irish boxer called Jack Donnelly who fought for the British bare knuckle heavyweight championship of the world in 18-something. And he came back to Dublin at Dunleary. He got off the boat, and there was a big chariot waiting for him. And he was being driven all the way by horse and coach to Kilcullen. Everybody mad, because this is the first time an Irishman had ever done this. And he was standing in the back of the truck, cart. And the next thing, the cart opens, and his mother gets into the cart beside him. And they're all waving. And the mother, in the end, can't stand it. And she says, "Well, never mind about him. I'm his mother, and these are the dogs that reared him." And she exposed. and she exposed her breasts to the crowds. I always remember that story, because it's not that my mother was like that, but when they opened it out to the what do you call it, to the audience, my mother put up her hand and said, "Oh, that lady in the second row." And my mother said, I thought, oh, Jesus, my mother's going to say, dear God Almighty. I don't know if anybody has ever had that experience of their mother standing up in public to say something. And they said, well, I'd like to say something. Why don't you tell? Hold on, me foreign correspondence thing is trying to come out again. She said, why don't you tell them about the time you got diarrhea and I had to get on your first communion day because you stuffed yourself with everything from Coca-Cola to trigger bars, and I had to get you out from behind Delaney's wall and bring you home.
That story did have me laughing out loud, I'm not going to lie. And another story that you told in the book, that if you might kind of indulge me, I found myself reading it a second time because I did think it was a particularly beautiful moment. You were speaking about when you met and worked with Laurence Olivier kind of early in your career, and the first interaction that you had with him really didn't go according to plan, but then there was a note afterwards, and I loved that story, and I can hope you might share it this evening.
Yeah, Laurence Olivier is one of my heroes growing up, and again, for people who don't remember, he was the greatest actor of his generation, the greatest film actor. Anybody who's ever seen Rebecca or Wuthering Heights, and the great stage actor of so many generations, a god, really, a theater god. And he was in this thing that I had a small part in. I was just starting up, so I had a small part. And I was walking down this corridor in the dressing room area, and this man came out in a dressing gown. And as he came closer, I realized this was Laurence Olivier, Sir Laurence Olivier. I had worshipped him since I was a kid. I'd seen him in the screen, in cinemas in Dublin, and I never thought. And as he came closer to me, I thought, I have to say something to him. I have to say, and he kind of glared at me, and I said, "Do you have the time?" And he turned and he glared at me, and he said, "Are they paying you on this thing?" And I said, "Yeah, yes, they are." And he said, "Then I suggest you buy a watch." And he walked on. And I thought, I don't like him. I just don't like him. How was he to know that I had worshipped him from afar for so long? Of course, he couldn't know that. But I just thought you could have been like, "Oh, no, I don't have my watch," or whatever. No, that was just rude. And I went around saying to people, you know what? No, I used some words about him. And maybe I'll just read, if I can find it, the last part of, if I can find it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to take up your time here.
61, I think it is. In
61, you know,
yeah.
Jesus, that's oh yeah. So now the interesting thing about it was I'd heard a story about him and Rex Harrison when they were young men in London. They were both envious of each other. Rex Harrison had the light comedy career. Laurence Olivier had the dramatic career, and they both wanted each other's career. So there was this underlying tension between them. Anyway, cut to 1984. Laurence Olivier was now a very old man and coming up to do his last thing. And he was in the lift in the Midland Hotel in Manchester. And he had long white hair and a long white beard. And he was coming down from his room and the lift stopped. And this other old man with long white hair and a beard got on. One of them was doing King Lear, the other was doing Heartbreak House in Manchester. And they didn't recognize each other. And it was Laurence Olivier and Rex Harrison, who had been in competition all their lives. So when I met him, I thought, I will never get the chance to meet him again. And what a pity that it turned out to be such a an unmemorable one. Anyway, I was disappointed. My only interaction with Olivier had been my stupid question about the time. My dressing room was no larger than a wardrobe, so I spent little time there except to sleep. The 3 nights, that's Sir Laurence Olivier, Sir John Gielgud, and Sir Ralph Richardson, who had never acted together, were in this movie, and they all left. My dressing room was no larger than a wardrobe, so I spent little time there except to sleep. I almost didn't see the small envelope addressed to me leaning against the mirror. Inside was a note from him. Apologies, old chap, if I appeared rather brusque when we met. I was attempting to knock lines into my stupid old head. I've thought about your question regarding the time. It's something I think about a great deal these days. And in reply, please allow a greater mind than I to answer. And there followed Shakespeare's Sonnet 60, written in neat black cursive. He had underlined the following lines. Like as the waves make toward the pebble shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. And time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. Affectionately, Larry.
That's stunning. Stunning. Speaking of time, we're way over, Gabriel.
I'm so sorry. You should have jumped in and said.
You are so generous with your time. Thank you so much. I have to ask you.
I'm like the guy that sits down beside you in the pub and you go like, how's it going? And 3 hours later, you're saying, in the name of Jesus, how do I get out of here?
And we to ask you one more question. I have to ask you one more question, if you don't mind. We, in the Little Museum of Dublin, we run a film competition for young filmmakers with our partners in Dublin Port, and it's a short film prize. And I just wonder if you could offer one piece of advice to a young filmmaker starting out in Dublin, a storyteller. What piece of advice would you give that person, please?
I'm not great on giving advice, but I would say that if what I know about the camera is true, the camera is your eye, and it's also your brain. And Cartier-Bresson, the French photographer, talked about the decisive moment. That moment when your brain, your finger, see something and capture it. A moment before, a moment after, it's not there. A camera makes you alive to your surroundings. You're looking for things that you can capture. I would say don't listen to anybody else. Don't imitate anybody else. It's your vision of Dublin, whether that's in the tiniest things or in the biggest things. But my experience is this, that it's the tiny things, the unremarkable things, the things that we pass by every day that we become so used to, that illuminate a much bigger truth. So try to find the things that you take for granted and try to find your particular, to listen to what's in your, but if you're somebody who appreciates a particular quality about Dublin, go for that. But don't ignore the tiny, small things that are around you, because it's in those tiny things that the biggest stories are.
That's brilliantly put. Thank you very much. Gabriel, just to finish, I know there's hundreds of people watching us from all over the world this evening.
Jesus,
I want to thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
I thought you and I were the only ones talking.
You were misinformed. But seriously, there's among the many positive reviews for this book, the the concluding line in one of them is that at the end of it, you kind of conclude that Gabriel Byrne might actually be a very nice person to know and to spend time with. And I think you've demonstrated that this evening. You've been absolutely brilliant company, and it's been such a privilege to you, for us, to have you as our guest this evening. You were good enough to honor a commitment that you made to me. You probably don't remember making it.
I remember it very well. It was on the steps of the little museum there.
That's right. 3 years ago. Yeah.
Was it 3 years ago?
It was 3 years ago. Yeah, and you were good enough to honor that.
And you know what the thing is, that every time I passed, I think, oh Jesus, I hope Trevor doesn't come down the steps again. Saying, because I think you were in there looking out the window waiting for it. So anyway, I'm really happy to have done it and to have contributed to it. And I hope that the little museum has long life before it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And a very, very happy Christmas to you, Gabriel.
And the same to you, Trevor, and to you, Sarah.
Likewise. Thank you
so much, guys.
Take care, folks.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.